Welcome to the Making Sense podcast. This is Sam Harris. Just a note to say that if you're hearing this, you are not currently on our subscriber feed and will only be hearing partial episodes of the podcast. If you'd like access to full episodes, you'll need to subscribe at samharris.org. There you'll find our private RSS feed to add to your favorite podcatcher, along with other subscriber-only content. And as always, I never want money to be the reason why someone can't listen to the podcast. So if you can't afford a subscription, there's an option at samharris.org to request a free account, and we grant 100% of those requests, no questions asked. I am here with Paige Harden. Paige, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
So just a few notes to our listeners that we're kind of jumping on this podcast because we had a bit of a Twitter collision, and then a very friendly person reached out to both of us to see if he or she could midwife a better conversation. So there's at least one thing that's relevant there is that, I haven't sent you the gear I usually send guests to get as close to perfect audio as we can get. So we're doing this over Skype, and apologies for any Skype-like glitches in your sound. Before we jump in, can you summarize your academic background and just what you've been focusing on as a scientist?
Yeah, so I am a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where I've been since graduate school. And I run a research lab there that is focused on genetic influences and how they shape child and adolescent development. So one part of that is on cognition and academic achievement, and then the other part of that is on mental health with a particular focus on antisocial behavior problems, delinquency, and crime. So I do twin studies and then a variety of measured DNA studies with using polygenic scores, which maybe we might dive into later.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the past 2 years, I've been writing a book. I'm about to be finished with it, although there's still a long road, I'm realizing, until a book is a physical object in the universe between finishing the manuscript and it being published, which is called The Genetic Lottery. So it's on the role of genes in shaping social inequalities, and is really trying to reshape that conversation away from thinking of genetics as an enemy of equality or equality hinging on genetic sameness, to really think about, given our current landscape, particularly in the US, how could we use genetic information and what we've learned from genetic studies to think about what it means when we say equality. So that's been my passion project for the last couple of years, and I'm excited to talk about that in relation to, I think, the many issues that I think we could touch base on today.
Oh, that's great. If memory serves, you'll have exactly 11 months to wait once you finish your book and to see it born.
Yeah.
An increasingly ridiculous 11 months given the nature of media these days.
Yeah. It's it feels very antiquated in relation to the immediacy of everything else that's happening right now.
Well, lucky for you, inequality is still going to be a problem after 11 months, so you will not be less relevant, I'm sure. So there's something I'd like to ask at the outset here, because I'm pretty confident that you and I are coming to this conversation from very different places, just with very different frames around what it means to have this conversation. I think our glitch on Twitter was born of that difference. So at the outset, I'd love to get your impression of why we're speaking now and what's happened between us. Because, we've never met, as far as I know. I don't think we've ever bumped into each other at a conference or anything. And yet we're entangled in some way now. So from your point of view, how did we get here, and what is your motive in having this conversation?
Yeah, so entangled is a good word for it. Spooky action at a distance. The origin of this is, you had a podcast with Charles Murray, I think going on 2 years ago now. Yeah. And I wrote an article with my former Ph.D. advisor, Eric Turkheimer, and social psychologist Dick Nisbet in Vox that was critical of Murray's portrayal of the state of the science, is how I viewed that article. And then there was reactions to that article, and then our response to those reactions. There was yet another piece on the same topic by Ezra Klein There was multiple conversations between you and Klein about whether our Vox piece, the substance of it, and whether soliciting it and publishing it was in good faith. And honestly, the aftermath of that, publishing of the Vox piece never sat well with me. I think in many ways, the parts of it I wrote in my head as I was writing it was very much me as a scientist responding to what I thought Murray was portraying inaccurately. And then I think as the article got published and sort of reverberated through social media, and as you know as well as I do, that has this weird funhouse mirror distortionate effect on conversations. It seemed that you felt criticized in a way that, to be quite honest, surprised me. Kind of the intensity of it. Something was being lost in my intention and how it was being received. And so, I kind of left that whole thing with that didn't go how I would have wanted it to go. And I don't feel like I communicated the messages that I was intending to with the precision that I wanted to. And then fast forward to, the most recent week, you had Robert Floman on your podcast to talk about his new book, Blueprint. And, I had what I think is a very kind of social media moment in which I am responding to someone else's comment on, what are we all going to do as parents around school closures? And someone responded with, oh, well, you need to listen to Sam Harris's new podcast because then you'll realize that going to school doesn't matter.
Mhm.
And it was such an alarming tweet, and with some backstory that I've known Robert Plumman for quite a long time. I respect him immensely as a scientist, but the role of whether or not schools and parents make a difference is a topic about which we've had multiple conversations, both public and private, and about which we disagree. So there really was just kind of like full circle moment in which I felt like, oh, are we back here talking about someone was on Sam Harris's podcast and how that information is being received by your audience and how I'm responding to it. And then I have to be really honest, I was really surprised when you responded on Twitter. I think I had this idea in my head that your platform is so enormous and there's so many people responding to you at any one time that the extent to which what I was saying about, not even in that moment, I wasn't even, as responding to the podcast, but so much to this, anonymous person who was saying, oh, you should listen to it because then you will realize that schools don't matter. Just really, was really upsetting to me in that moment. And it really kind of kicked off I think sense, at least I have this sense of sort of having unresolved, and to go back to your original word, unresolved entanglement, that we're both interested in these issues, that the conversation really was not between you and me the last time around the Vox article. And I think maybe something was lost in that, and how that played out. So I'm hoping that by having this conversation, we will each get something out of it. We will learn something about our respective perspectives, but also that we can move forward. I mean, I don't think that you're going to move away from being interested in these issues. And certainly I'm not. I mean, as you say, in 11 months, inequality is still going to be a problem. And I'd like to move forward feeling like there's a mutually respectful relationship. And that wasn't what was playing out on Twitter. So that's kind of where I'm really hoping this conversation goes today.
Nice. Well, we definitely share the goal there. And another thing we share, I'm sure, given everything you've just said, is a concern about social inequality and social cohesion and just the suffering of other people. I'm sure we both want other people to thrive, both because we care about other people, but also just for purely selfish reasons. I'm sure we both would much prefer to live in a society that is filled with happy, self-actualized people. And, I trust you don't like to see the sidewalks filled with homeless people any more than I do. And I mean, again, both for the sake of the people themselves and for our own quality of life, right? So I think everyone has an interest in these issues. And so everyone, whether they're thinking about it or not, has an interest in things like wealth inequality and the crazy disparities in crime and access to health care in our society and failing schools. And, insofar as racism remains a problem, and the cause of other problems. I think you and I are both concerned about racism. I think it's safe to say, but I think I should say a couple of things about how I'm coming to these issues that will explain what was otherwise surprising about my reaction to your Vox piece. One, my reaction and my non-reaction. I mean, one, I didn't actually answer. I didn't respond to your Vox piece, and many people thought I should have, because many people saw it as a serious scientific criticism of a conversation I had on my podcast. And, I must say I didn't view it that way, and that's why I didn't respond, among other things. And so, so let me see if I can just launch into an account of what has happened here for me, and to explain just what would otherwise seem like bizarre behavior. First, I think we should distinguish two topics here. I mean, there's the scientific topic of human intelligence and differences in human abilities generally. Whether we explain these differences environmentally or genetically or both, all of that is interesting and consequential and important to talk about honestly, and there's that topic. But then there's this sociological and political fact that it's difficult to talk about these things, right? And it's
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and so those are two very different things. And I'm really brought to this topic mostly because of my focus on the second topic. I mean, that's certainly why I had Murray on my podcast. So again, just to be clear, we need to distinguish certain scientific topics from the fact that talking about the science, right, is rightly perceived, I think, to be professionally dangerous and personally toxic. That is, unless one is committed to maintaining a certain kind of political correctness, more or less at all costs here.
So if I can just jump in there really quickly, I roughly agree with that division, but I think, and we can circle back to this. I think failures in either make the other more difficult, in the sense that, like, if we can't speak, openly and honestly about the science, that makes doing the science harder. But I think also people, our responsibility to talk about the science as clearly as possible is part of what I think of the scientists' contribution to sort of keeping cancel culture at bay. So I think I agree with the division that we can sort of think of those two issues, but I think they do affect each other in the real world in kind of this continuous basis.
Yeah, except I think you and I will draw that boundary a little differently. And I can argue about why I draw the boundary as I do, because I think it's important. I think any principle other than intellectual honesty that would cause us to make certain scientific claims is very nature going to be unstable and prove to be a bad bulwark against the kind of social outcomes that I think you and I both would recoil from, right? So I think we'll probably get into that. But I mean, just again, for context, and I think I said this at the top, you and I were brought together by a moderator who wants to remain anonymous and inaudible in this conversation. We have someone on the line with us who hasn't yet chimed in, but may yet chime in, and we will edit out those intrusions. This person wants to remain anonymous because they, and I'm using they to conceal gender, not to say that they are transgender, they perceive this whole topic to be so fraught that they are concerned that this might blow back on them or institutions with which they're associated. That's just a sign of the times, right? You and I just we obviously calibrate our sense of the risk differently, but that's the nature of the context in which we're having this conversation.
I just want to say I don't disagree with our anonymous third participant. I have been in the field of behavior genetics essentially my whole adult life. I applied for graduate school when I was 20 years old. And so that sense of this, thinking about how genetics relates to inequalities between people and what implications that has for our policies, for our nation, our intuitions about justice and fairness, is really strikes at the heart of so many issues that people feel passionately about, and by virtue of being an explosive topic, requires communicating about it with great care And I think if you're going to do it, you have to do it well. And to say, well, I'm willing to be interested in this issue, but I'm not going to drag a whole bunch of other people, by virtue of my association with them into that morass. I mean, I agree that there are potential implications, even just in terms of time, for anyone being sort of associated with this conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I view all of that as ultimately unnecessary, not surprising, but unnecessary. And I think whatever political daylight we eventually land in that is stable will be born of our having discovered that this is really not a problem to talk about, right? And that's where I'm hoping to get to. But the strategies I see other people using, I think, are bound to be ineffective, and they have the additional problem of creating a lot of casualties of another sort along the way. And so just to give you some color to my experience here. So first, I'm interested in intelligence, both human and artificial, but I've never been interested in IQ per se, and I'm certainly not interested in racial differences in IQ. But I've grown extremely concerned about the way our capacity for moral panic has made it difficult to have honest conversations in general about just all kinds of topics having nothing to do with behavioral genetics or intelligence, or just across the board. And talking about religion, for instance, or differences among religions. And I really don't like scapegoating and mob justice. And this is the kind of thing one encounters on this topic. So as you said, 2 years ago, I brought Charles Murray on my podcast for reasons around these free speech concerns, right? This was in response to his being physically attacked at Middlebury, a full quarter century after he wrote his controversial book, The Bell Curve. And I can say that having that conversation with him has had a profoundly negative effect on my life, right? And it's not because anything Charles said or did. And it's entirely because of what other people said and did in response to that conversation. And, some of that was foreseeable, certainly should have been foreseeable. And, so to some degree, I consciously took this on as something that, I felt a moral obligation to respond to what I perceived to be both an injustice in his case and a creeping dysfunction in our intellectual life. The fact that you have professors being assaulted on college campuses for highly distorted ideas about what they wrote 25 years ago. And you were one of the principal people who contributed to this backlash by publishing that article in Vox, right, along with, as you said, Richard Nisbett and Eric Turkheimer. And now you may not think it was a smear, but in my world, it absolutely was, right? And it gave Ezra Klein the scientific cover, or the seeming scientific cover, to publish other smears of me and Murray in Vox. And it's one thing to differ about, specific interpretations of data, say, but the reality is that that article accused me and Murray. I think you thought your emphasis was mostly on Murray, and it was, but virtually every sentence, I was wrapped up there as part of the problem. You accused us of peddling junk science, right? And the best interpretation of how I came out in that article was as Murray's dupe, right? Like I didn't understand the science and he put one over on me. But the more reasonable interpretation of the article was that I was more of a willing accomplice in the spread of dangerous and discredited ideas. And whatever you thought your take on my podcast with Murray was, and whatever top spin you thought you were giving the part of the article you wrote or not, and however much daylight there might be between you and Nisbett and Turkheimer, the net result of that article was to land me on the hate watch page at the Southern Poverty Law Center in the company of neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan lunatics, right?
Yeah.
Whether or not you thought it was a smear, in the current environment, it absolutely functioned as a smear, right? And it is, when I, pinged you on Twitter the other day, what I was really responding to was, I was responding to two things: your seeming outraged that I would, quote, platform Robert Plomin, right? Which, using the phrase platform in response to my putting a person who's inarguably one of the leading people in the field on my podcast, seemed bizarre to me and seemed of a piece with the article you had written about me and Murray. But you resurfaced your Vox article, right? Which, again, in my world,
Mm-hmm.
functions as, for people who don't get into it, people who can't take the time to listen to a 2-hour podcast and don't have enough understanding of the topic to see, as I think I do, the mismatch between your article and what I and Murray actually said in that podcast. That article functions as scientific proof, essentially, that I'm a racist asshole, or at least dangerously irresponsible in my platforming a racist asshole on my podcast. And that's just an objective statement about how this thing functions in my life. And so to see you retweet it and then take a shot at me for having, quote, platformed Robert Plomin, you got a somewhat snide response from me on Twitter. Like, really, Paige? This is, and you did this all without listening
Yeah.
to the podcast with Robert Plomin? Man, that's amazing, right? So, some people think I'm just being thin-skinned and, I can't take criticism of my views. That's not what's happening. I mean, unless you see what's coming back at me on a daily basis and see the effect in my life and in the lives of others. I mean, the truth is, I have taken immense pains to be uncancelable, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
effectively am uncancelable. So I'm an incredibly lucky person, right? I have very few complaints about my life, but this is definitely one. I mean, I recognize that because of what happened there, and in large measure because of the article you wrote, and then what Ezra Klein did with it, it may well be the case that 30, 40 years from now, when I die at the end of a long and happy life, my daughters will read that, I was persistently dogged by accusations of racism or something completely insane, given what I actually feel about race and racism and what it would mean to live in a just society. And the causality of that is absolutely apparent to me, given the social forces and the social incentives and the
Mm-hmm.
biases I see around this conversation. So that's who you were meeting on Twitter the other day.
Yeah. Okay. So, I have a couple responses to that. And the first is just, that helps me understand more about kind of the tenor of your response, because thinking about it in terms of how my article, but particularly how that article was picked up and reverberated and interpreted to ultimately lead to you being, clustered with neo-Nazis. I can see how that would be deeply upsetting. When I, what I feel like this brings up for me is there's a kind of ironic parallel here, in the sense that you're saying, you wrote this thing and you didn't intend for it to, lead to other people casting aspersions on me as a racist or as a Nazi, but it had that effect given the social environment that we live in and the way that journalism works. So don't you bear some responsibility for how that criticism was used?
Well, let me just clarify one thing. It's not as
Yeah.
inadvertent as all that, because I mean, honestly, I should just give you a little more color for
Yeah.
what I think about the article. I mean, the only way to interpret the article is that Murray and I, again, it's more Murray. I mean, I'm sort of showcasing his views, but, I was also signing off on many of the things he was claiming, and, you made that clear in the article. But the frame you gave it is that these are dangerous, well known to be discredited views. I mean, it wasn't totally coherent, because in one paragraph you guys say, the truth is there are many scientists whose views are much closer to Murray's than to ours. And we don't even have the same views, right? So, like, you did sort of pay lip service to the idea that there is a continuum of views about, now we're talking about the heritability of intelligence and just how and group differences in intelligence here. That's the most toxic topic. So you paid a little lip service to it, but basically the general thrust of the article was that this is junk science, and it's dangerous, it's irresponsible, and it is of a piece with a long history of awful justifications for racists, pseudoscientific justifications for
Mhm.
racism and bigotry and slavery and all the rest. And we're now part of that. And So there's no way to say, I mean, I hear where you're going. You think that I'm trying to hold you responsible for the completely inadvertent interpretations that some people have made of your article, but it's most of it is there in the article. And there is no commitment to racism and no cover for white supremacy given in my framing of Murray. Or honestly, even, I mean, we'll get into this, but even in what I understand to be Murray's views.
So, I mean, I think this is, yeah. So, I mean, for our listeners who have not read the article or listened to the podcast, I think, and also just to give a little bit of backstory, is I think many times people who respond to Charles Murray's basic thesis, which is that one, IQ tests have predictive validity for things we care about, that individual differences in intelligence are substantially heritable, and that group differences between racial ethnic groups and IQ are likely genetic in origin. And then four, that because of that, things will be, the kind of, we have some pessimism about the possibilities of social policy.
Go back to three for 1 second, because this is a crucial distortion in your article that was just unnecessary. And I mean, it's there for anyone who wants to go back and read your article and then listen to the 2-hour podcast. And at the time, I assumed most people would do that and they'd be able to do that. But of course, that's a ridiculous assumption. And most people just either read the article and didn't take the time to listen to the podcast, or, having listened to the podcast, they read the article and they couldn't remember what was in the podcast. And most important, people are so desperate to believe that Charles Murray is a racist monster and that this whole topic of racial differences in IQ is radioactive for very good reason, that they're overwhelmingly biased just to accept the claims you made in that article at face value. But the claim you just made, that Murray puts, I think it was your point number 3, you just enumerated, that Murray thinks this explanation for racial differences in IQ is very likely to be mostly genetic. That is just untrue, right? It's untrue in the bell curve. It's untrue in the podcast. At several places in that podcast, we spelled out why, even if intelligence is 80% heritable, say, you could not say that the differences between groups was due to genetics. In fact, it could be 100% environmental. I mean, I think in the podcast, I used the analogy to height. You could have an island of people who have the genes to be as tall as the Dutch, but if they were malnourished, and you found them to be shorter than the Inuit, it would be 100% due to environment. And so we made those caveats. And when I made that particular caveat, Charles Murray, his first sentence was, that's a crucial point, right? I mean, the irony is that there's a tiny substantive difference between you. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but in my understanding of your view, and again, I don't know what distinguishes you from Nisbet and Turkheimer on this point, if anything, but the only difference between what you're arguing for and what Murray is arguing for is what we might call a default hypothesis with respect to the role that genes play in group difference, right? And is actually something that Richard Hare brought out. So Richard Hare, who I don't know, I've only spoken to him once, and I I've never met him, and he unsolicited responded to your Vox piece, right? Here, Richard Hare is the editor-in-chief of the journal Intelligence, and he's the author of the book, The Neurobiology of Intelligence, right? And so he's a person who's in this field, and he came out of the woodwork in response to your Vox piece. And Ezra Klein, I mean, just so people understand how the sausage of, in my view, defamation gets made, Ezra Klein refused to publish that response from Hare, as though he had run out of pixels on the Vox website. And then Richard Hare wrote a follow-up response to your second piece in Vox, which also Vox refused to publish. But the point he made is that for people in the field of intelligence, and you clearly have a different view of this, but this was his view, again, unsolicited, is that the default hypothesis is that for a highly heritable trait individually, like intelligence, it's a safe default assumption that genes will play some role, not the majority role, just some involvement in group differences. and this was Murray's point in the podcast, otherwise to have a different default assumption, to say that we're going to default to it's 100% environment and genes play absolutely no role whatsoever, right? It seems like it's an assumption you need to argue for. I mean, this is a minuscule difference in terms of what someone's finding plausible.
I don't think it's a minuscule difference.
Do you not think it's a minuscule difference because of your judgment of scientific plausibility, or because of your concern for the social effects of one assumption versus the other?
Because of the science, I would say because of the depth of evidence for it as a scientific hypothesis. So this is a really unintuitive point. You know, we can talk about how if within a group differences between people are caused by genes and differences between groups could still be due to the environment. But I think lurking behind there's still this intuition that, well, but how plausible is that? And if there were genetic differences, you know, they would obviously work in the same direction that we see, you know, in the case of phenotypic differences, right? So I think it sounds so plausible to call it a default, to say, well, we know that genes cause intelligence differences within white people. We know that there's phenotypic differences on average in IQ between racial groups. Shouldn't our kind of running null hypothesis, you know, our prior, given the absence of any good evidence either way, shouldn't our prior be that the genes are also involved in the group differences? And I think that idea of what our prior should be is really based on like a very basic statistical misunderstanding.
I mean, according to Richard Hare, this is the default hypothesis among intelligence researchers. I mean, it's actually named that.
I'd like to give a concrete example that I think illustrates this. So, you know, recently there was a paper in bioRxiv by a team of people that do ancient DNA studies, which was finding that one of the early genetic loci associated with having a particularly bad response to COVID is something that we seem to have gotten from our Neanderthal ancestors. So, you know, everything in COVID genetics is very preliminary right now. Like the paper, I think, is still in archive. It hasn't been published yet. But if you look at the paper, you see, okay, well, here's a genetic variant that makes people more likely to develop bad complications from COVID and to die from COVID. And then if you look at the worldwide distribution of that gene, you'll see that it's absent in Africans because, you know, they do not have a significant proportion of Neanderthal genetic ancestry. So you have an example of within people of European ancestry, we can look and we can say, here's a gene that's associated with this response. And then if you looked at the phenotypic differences in, you know, bad outcomes from COVID across groups of people, you might, using Hire's default hypothesis logic, say, well, genes cause, you know, this gene causes bad COVID response in white people. There's so much worse medical outcomes in Black people. It must be that part of this difference between them is genetically caused. And what's more, it's because they have more of this genetic risk that we're seeing. But in fact, they have none of it, right? It's like the genetic differences that we're seeing within people of European ancestry cannot explain at all the differences we're seeing between white people and Black people in terms of their medical outcomes. And what's more, it goes in the opposite direction, as you would expect based on the within person genetic differences. So that's not specific to a discussion of intelligence. That's not specific to a discussion of IQ. It's a really, really, really basic statistical point, which is that if you know the direction of an association within a group, You don't know anything about whether that plays out between groups, not even in the sign of that direction, right? So it could be that, let's say actually Africans are at a genetic advantage for cognitive ability that's been swamped by, environmental
Hmm.
risks and diversity. And I think once you realize that that's not just about IQ. That's about, that was labeled as the ecological fallacy. That's like a basic statistical point. You really, where I've come to is that we have no information, no default about what is the relationship between differences in genetic ancestry and the causes of these cognition differences that we see on average between groups. And in the absence of any data, any really good data, the only priors we have are informed by what, right? And so that's why I think the prior that there is a genetic difference, and what's more, it works in this particular direction, is not informed by the science. And that's the part that I don't think that's a minor disagreement. So I think if we look at the evidence for how much does IQ statistically predict life outcomes in people, there is a huge amount of evidence there, and people might not like to hear it, but we can talk objectively about what that means. When we're talking about what is a reasonable prior in terms of our explanations for group differences in performance and standardized IQ tests, I don't agree with the framing that what has been called the default hypothesis is actually a reasonable prior, because I think that's based on a really basic misunderstanding of what knowledge within groups tells us about causes between groups.
Hmm.
So I think that's tricky to describe, because default hypothesis sounds like such a you know, reasonable norm, but I don't think it's agnostic enough about what we know.
Okay. So now I mean, all of that's interesting and useful. And for me, again, it falls into the bin of being what I think is a very minor difference in scientific intuition, which we can continue to drill down on. I think it's interesting. It's contained in the analogy I just gave to height. If we find an island of short people, they may in fact have the genes that point in the opposite direction, right? Entirely. They may have the Dutch, super
Mhm.
tall genes. They could just be malnourished, right? So, environment completely swamps their genetic advantage for height. And obviously, we could be in that circumstance with respect to the differences between black and white IQ scores in the US or any other invidious group difference we seem to have found through psychometrics. That's totally true. And I really think Charles Murray would admit that if put that way. But in terms of it being a different intuition scientifically about, what the default should be, it seems to me a fairly minor point. And it's a point, most importantly, it's a point about which totally well-intentioned people can disagree, right? And, often Murray just leaves it as he's agnostic, right? And it just seems a safer assumption that genes are involved. And again, you're right. He's assuming the valence there, that the genes are making the
Mhm.
contribution in the direction of a disadvantage.
So I think, this is probably, I think, where the kernel of our core disagreement lies,
Hmm.
which is that Murray is saying I'm agnostic, and is sort of saying I'm agnostic about a range of possibilities, which often when he talks doesn't include the possibility that there is a genetic advantage, quote unquote, to people of African ancestry. I'm saying, there's just really no good science about this. And so I think where the more major disagreement is what is the risk to benefit ratio of spending time pontificating about that possibility in the absence of any real scientific data. So I think if you have one set of values, I think it's well, we should just be able to talk openly and honestly about, any possibility that exists. And this is one possibility of the world. And we don't have any good data to suggest that it's true, but let's speculate. And it's really kind of our ability to talk about any possibility that might exist in the world is kind of prioritized. I think where other people might also have not a different value, but weight a different value is, well, what are the harms potentially done by that speculation? And I think for a lot of people, they think about, well, that is a speculation that, even if it doesn't necessarily feed into, is it at least consistent with some really ugly racist views about the inferiority of Black people in particular. And so I think some people push back on this. Well, why should we talk about something about which we are scientifically agnostic that just so happens to reinforce a really ugly stereotype? I think for me personally, I am frustrated by the amount of attention that this topic eats up when we have so much good genetic data and so many exciting methodological developments that are on much better scientific ground, that we could be talking about how do we use those to improve people's lives. But instead, everyone gets kind of sucked into this black hole of like speculating about racial differences when we don't really have ready data or methods to solve that problem. And so I just think there's a real opportunity cost, given how, in your own words, fraught and explosive this topic is, to paying so much attention to something that we can't and haven't solved well with data, at the expense of talking about all the things we could, solve with data that we do have good scientific information on. So I think, my risk-benefit calculus on what good versus what harm is done by letting people, speculate wildly in the absence of scientific data on the sources of Black-white IQ differences, I think I come down on a different risk-benefit calculus than you do about that.
Okay, well, so there's a lot contained in the phrase letting people speculate.
Yes. Yeah. As soon as I said it, I thought that's kind of like a strange, it's like.
Yeah, that is strange, Mr. Orwell. You and I totally agree about the opportunity costs here, but I view them as coming from a different quarter, because I have no interest in IQ, and I really have no interest in IQ differences among groups, right? So it's not for an intrinsic interest in this topic that I have suffered massive opportunity costs in getting sucked into this black hole, right? What I am concerned about is the quality of our public conversation about everything and the defenestrations of good people for bad reasons, and the voxification of science and journalism that leads to witch hunts and blasphemy tests and scapegoating and all the rest. And what I think I'm seeing here is a failure to distinguish scientific disagreement from the pressures of politics and social activism. And I'm seeing most people, even most journalists and scientists, pin their hopes for political equality and social cohesion and good outcomes, the hope for a good society, on our ability to either avoid certain topics until the end of the world, or pretend that certain plausible assumptions are in fact not plausible, but rather just so outrageously unlikely and socially damaging that a person could only entertain them based on a desire to live in a society that isn't good, right? That is racist. So the assumption that people come away with, whether you consciously felt this about me and Murray or not, I would be happy to know, but the moralizing topspin of the article you and your co-authors wrote, and certainly the effect in the world, is that it suggests that only someone who's committed to maintaining social inequality, right? Only someone who is selfishly committed to maintaining the unfair advantages of their group based on racism. Again, this is something that the onus is on white people here. Strangely, it's not on Asians, right, who compare favorably to everybody on this particular metric. Only someone who's just morally deranged by our modern lights could be tempted to take what Charles Murray says about race and IQ seriously, or could have a default hypothesis that suggests that, well, we don't know what genes are doing here, but they're probably playing a role, and they're probably playing a role in the observed direction of disparity. And I think that's, one, deeply unfair, but worse, I think it's dishonest with respect to the actual nature of the scientific differences. I think it will be bowled over by coming developments in genetics and in other sciences. So I think it's unstable. I think it's not actually a safe space to occupy, given the coming advances in science. And this is my big picture concern. I think this is my default hypothesis that applies to everything across the board, not just intelligence. If you could list the top 100 things that we care about in human beings, intelligence would be one. I don't know where it would be on the list, but somewhere in the top half, certainly. But list everything we care about, the big 5 personality traits and susceptibility to violence and shyness and compassion and everything, sense of humor, right? I think virtually all of these things on the list will be dictated to some significant degree by genetics, in the case of individuals, and to some significant degree by environment. But the thing that will pose a political concern for people is that if we had ways of testing, ways of measuring all of these traits, and in many cases we do, and we decided to exhaustively test differences between groups, we would find differences. It would be an absolute miracle if the mean value for the 100 things we most cared about were the same for every conceivable group of human beings. And again, it wouldn't even matter how you pick these groups. These groups could be self-identified. They could be Yankee fans versus Red Sox fans. They could be the Norwegians. They could be people who think they're Norwegian but are wrong about it. We could chop up humanity in every conceivable way and test these groups, and we're going to find mean differences. So my view politically is we need to be able to absorb that fact and realize that it doesn't fucking matter, right? It really doesn't matter.
So there's so much to respond to in that. So I think the first is, you surely have noticed that the second Fox article, we didn't co-author it.
If you'd like to continue listening to this podcast, you'll need to subscribe at samharris.org. You'll get access to all full-length episodes of the Making Sense podcast and to other subscriber-only content, including bonus episodes and AMAs, and the conversations I've been having on the Waking Up app. The Making Sense podcast is ad-free and relies entirely on listener support, and you can subscribe now at samharris.org.